His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We find ourselves in the middle of an accidental Freeport trilogy, so we are returning to that village on the south shore of Long Island in Nassau County. Today's topic takes us to 1914. It's a story of scandal and gossip and innuendo and, above all, murder. A true crime tale torn from the day's headlines. We're going to spell it out for you, but we're also going to go deeper behind those headlines into the newspapers that covered it, how they covered it. You'll be amazed how contemporary the whole thing feels, as it turns out that 110 years is actually not that long ago. So now let's take a closer look with today's very special guest.
I'm Woody Register. I teach U.S. history at the University of the South, which is a small liberal arts college that most people know as Sewanee. But I'm also the director of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation here, which is looking into and trying to understand my institution's historical connections with slavery and slavery's legacies.
And we will link to all of your information. You are in Tennessee, correct?
Yes, I'm in Tennessee, not far from Chattanooga.
Great. And just sort of a way of introduction or getting into the topic, I noticed a lot of your research or a strand of it touches a lot on New York City history or in the metropolitan area in the turn of the last century. What drew you to that topic or those topics?
Oh, well, I guess. I mean, I love of New York City, to be honest. And yeah, I think certainly for most of my career, I have been drawn to topics that have drawn me to New York. I've spent a lot of time in the city. I have lots of friends there. I know the libraries and the archives there very well. So these days, I'm not spending so much time there. In fact, since the pandemic, I don't think I've been in New York State at all, but I have plans to return.
That's great. And I'll just mention, since I have a list in front of me, part of that research involves the history of Coney Island and Fred Thompson, and then work with the Upper East Side street kids. I'm going to go look into your Mucker's manuscript that you found in the archives and published, which is the 1890s memoir. Well, it's a fictionalized memoir, would you say, of young toughs, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's written by a boy from the New York City streets about growing up on the, in this case, it was the way Upper East Side immigrant neighborhood of Yorkville. And but it tells us a lot that we didn't know about the world of children, especially the world of boys in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I recommend the book very highly.
So we are turning our attention, though, to Freeport and an article that you published in 2014. Do you want to give us the title? Do you have that in front of you?
Yeah, I do have the title. The title is Some Truths About the Rumors, Gossip, Hearsay, and Innuendos Surrounding the Freeport Murder Mystery of 1914.
How did you come to that specific? It wasn't a case I had heard about. You know, we talk about true crime being so prevalent these days, but there's true crime going back. You know, you could go back to the murder ballads in London, Great Britain. But so, as a true crime story, how did you come across the details of this murder mystery?
Well, indirectly, let's say. It was not my intention or focus to dive deeply into the history of Freeport or Long Island. So it actually started with the device that turned out to be at the center of the whole scandal and mystery here, the dictograph, which I had encountered in another context. It was something I'd never heard of and surprised me in many, many ways. The more I learned about it, the more I learned about its widespread use in the early 20th century. And it was through investigating the dictograph that I came across the Carman murder mystery. And that's what led me to Freeport.
So I'll give some basics, but you can correct me as I go through. But we're talking about June 30th, 1914. Louise Bailey, who was actually from Hempstead but was visiting a doctor on Merrick Road in his home office, and was shot through the window, right, in the doctor's office.
Yeah, the doctor's examining room. Uh-huh.
And, well, a couple of things, and I'll just throw these in as we go along. And as we're looking back, this is over 100 years ago now, but the fact that people were visiting the doctor at this was about 7 o'clock at night. It was after dinner. This was happening.
Yeah, I think doctors in those days not only did house calls, they also held extended office hours. Which came as a surprise to me also. But yeah, Dr. Edwin Carman was a physician in Freeport with a thriving practice. I've never been to Freeport, so I'm not familiar with the streets or any of the locations that are in this story. But so I'll rely on you to tell me or to give me some context there. But Dr. Carman had as I said, he had a thriving practice. They lived in a fairly large, substantial home, and that was, which also served as his office. He lived there with his wife and daughter and his in-laws, and I believe his wife's sister also. So there was plenty of room for everyone, plus a medical office on the first floor there in their home.
Sure, and it's interesting in terms of, and this all plays out through the newspaper coverage, so the cast of characters changes or the details come out in different, at a different pace. But there were people in the waiting room. There was a maid in the kitchen, the wife, and he had there was a daughter in the house, and I think the mother-in-law, like you mentioned, I don't know if the sister was home, but there were a lot of people around. But yet someone put a .38 caliber through the window and shot and got away without really any eyewitness.
Exactly. There were plenty of people around, plenty of potential witnesses, and there may have been actual witnesses. The record's a little unclear there that some of the people who had been in the waiting room, 2 women, in fact, seem to have disappeared without a trace. But yes, somebody, as Mrs. Bailey was in the examining room being tended to by the doctor, someone burst the panes in one of the window, stuck a gun through there, and fired a single shot. The doctor thought the gun was aimed at him, fell to the floor, and Mrs. Bailey took the bullet just under her shoulder and died not long after that. So no one, the only only identifying feature that anyone saw or anyone admitted to seeing was the hand holding the pistol.
Yeah, and so it comes out pretty quickly that Florence Carman was is portrayed as a very jealous wife, and you were mentioning a device. So it quickly becomes news that prior to this murder, she had some secret device installed in her husband's office. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah. So the device you were talking about was known at the time as the detective dictograph, and it was a surveillance device, a listening device. It's really just a microphone about the size or a little smaller than my fist, attached by a wire to a set of headphones like the ones I'm wearing right now. And these devices became widely used, very widely used in American life all over the country after about 1907, 1909. And Mrs. Carman, saying that she was concerned that her husband was having affairs with the women, making unwelcome advances toward the women whom he examined in his office, went to the dictograph company, the American Dictograph Company, and persuaded them to install one in her husband's office so that she could listen in and hear what he was saying to his patients. And she had done this several weeks before the murder. And then after the murder, she went into a panic that, that the police would discover this listening device and that would bring her under suspicion for the murder. And that's exactly what happened. They did find it, and not long after, she was accused of being the one of owning the hand that stuck the gun that fired the shot that killed Mrs. Bailey. So the dictograph is what led me to this case. It appears in so many different circumstances across the country in the early 20th century, and it was a device that was developed originally to help the hard of hearing, as you would it had a little carrying case, and you would take it wherever you went, turn it on, and if you were hard of hearing, you put on a pair of headphones, and that of course amplified the voice or the sounds that you wished to listen to. But it didn't take the inventor of the dictograph very long to see that he had a much bigger market for this device for electronic eavesdropping. And if nothing else, it's used in electronic eavesdropping as a device for solving crimes, for uncovering corruption. That would bring him more publicity, and he would sell more for people who were who had hearing deficiencies. So he had this whole market set up, and apparently had robust sales for several decades.
Did you get a sense how unique was this sort of private in-home use that Florence Carman was using it for?
Well, I think quite prevalent. I don't have too many examples of this. They appear in newspaper accounts of divorce proceedings and other kinds of situations. But if you look at the advertisements that private detectives private investigators placed in newspapers, they routinely advertise themselves as skilled in the use of the dictograph. And part of what, this is a little tangential to what we're talking about, but part of what fascinated me, one was the claims that were made for the dictograph, the idea that if we could just listen in to people's secret conversations, we would gain this unimpeachable insight into the kind of secret order or the secret corruption of the world. So there was a belief, in the power of eavesdropping to discover the truth. But even more noticeable to me was the lack of people's concerns. There was no real conception of a right to privacy or a private space that was violated by these devices. Almost no outrage about a violation or a misuse of power to invade those areas that should be protected as private. In fact, you read almost no criticism of dictograph use. The problem with Mrs. Carman, as the newspapers reported, no one, as I recall, complained that she had trespassed on the doctor-patient privilege. The criticism of her was that she was an insanely jealous wife. That was the subject that was worth talking about, not the use of the dictograph, which I think most people thought was, perfectly natural that she would do so when you're insanely jealous.
Well, I could imagine every patient in Freeport who went to Dr. Carman reading that headline and realizing that his wife was listening into every visit that they, or potentially what they had talked in that room. So just in the context of the scene, we'll go back to that. So the wife, Florence, would have been up the wire from the dictograph went up to the bedroom, I believe, right? So she would have sat up there and listened. It's amazing that we don't know if the husband ever noticed it beforehand or what conversation they had. They had other things to worry about at the time, but learning that your wife had bugged you basically is an interesting conversation. So, in one scenario, if she was the shooter, she would have had to have gone from upstairs back downstairs. And maybe we can mention the black maid, Celia Coleman, who was in the kitchen, initially testified that Mrs. Carman never came downstairs, that she didn't come in and out. But that changed.
Yeah, so the Carmans were prominent, comparatively wealthy citizens of Freeport. They had a large home, and of course they had an African-American maid to cook and to clean their home for them. This was a young woman, Celia Coleman, And she was in the kitchen. And in her earliest testimony or conversations with the police and testimony at I believe at the inquest, she covered for Mrs. Carman. But at the trial, she said that her earlier claims were false, and that in fact she had seen Mrs. Carman go through the kitchen and out the back door, heard the shots fired, and then saw Mrs. Carman rush back in and proceed upstairs. So she became a critical witness in the two trials. There were two trials, and both of them turned on whether the African American maid was credible. And the first trial ended in a deadlock, and no verdict was returned. And in the second, the jurors deemed, some of the jurors at least, deemed Celia Coleman not believable, and Mrs. Carman was acquitted.
And no weapon was ever found?
No one ever found the weapon. I mean, the thing is, we don't know to what degree Dr. and Mrs. Carman were cooperating with each other, were protecting each other. It's hard to tell. Freeport then was a small town. Everyone more or less knew each other, and people knew the Carmans, and they knew Dr. Carman, and they knew what kind of a doctor he was. And it's unclear. I mean, it's worth mentioning the Carmans never got divorced. They never split up over this. Their marriage continued and until his death. So something was happening in the background on all of this. And Celia Coleman, the maid, was the first to crack.
So Dr. Carman, very, very popular. I guess they described him as good looking. There was no evidence, even though his wife was jealous, that he was particularly running around on her. At least that never came from. But he did have a large female clientele. And just to go back to Louise Bailey, who's the victim in all of this, she was coming to Freeport that night. Apparently she hadn't told anyone that she was going to see a doctor in Freeport. And she had gone to visit somebody else somewhere else and was sort of coming again, as we said, after hours or after dinner at least. I'll preface with another point of fact. It was reported in the paper that Louise Bailey went to him about a case of malaria, wanted to get treatment for malaria.
Yes, he had given her quinine. He said he had given her quinine pills to help her feel better. But that was all a lie. What came out, what the police discovered very quickly, and changed the tenor of the investigation, was that when Mrs. Bailey arrived at the doctor's office and was killed, she was pregnant. And the secret of that was behind the whole mystery, and is one that apparently it was an open secret. Everyone in Freeport and people in all around the region knew that Dr. Carman helped women who were pregnant, helped them with what at the time were called illegal operations or abortions. And that Mrs. Bailey had gone there, not because she felt poorly, but she went there to get help from him in ending her pregnancy. And so then the question, of course, is whether this had anything to do with her murder. Did the hand with the pistol mean to kill Dr. Carman, or did the hand mean to kill Mrs. Bailey? And in what way was the doctor's wife, Florence Carman, involved in this? Why would she want to shoot either of them? So I'm not sure I've explained that very well there, Chris.
No, it is. And it actually reinforces, I don't know if you would call it delicacy or the, in reading and I've read some of the, not as much as you, but I've read some of the newspaper coverage, and they do talk around the issue, right? And the euphemisms and things that they bring in. So we can bring into maybe the newspaper coverage. So as you were unpacking this, when did it become clear to you that that's what they were talking about? Or had you known going in, had it been uncovered previously that this was somewhat an abortion case?
No, it was a total revelation to me. I thought it was an insanely jealous wife case. And I thought that it all turned on the dictograph and its use in exposing the doctor as a roustabout, a cad, a ladies' man. And so I was completely taken aback when it became evident to me, not very quickly once I actually started reading the accounts, and there were millions of words published about this murder and the scandal. That even though it was almost never directly stated that Dr. Carman was a known abortionist, or that Mrs. Bailey had been there to receive an abortion. It was hinted at. It was implied. It was between the lines that was it's somehow related to the murder and at the center of the scandal. So this led me to start thinking about how different newspapers covered the story. And I'm sure you from your own investigations and knowledge about the period, you know that this was a time of unusually lively newspaper competition, and that newspapers were so vastly more important in the early 20th century than, I'm at least sad to say, than they are today. And then New York City was the capital of the publishing world, the newspaper publishing world. So I became more sensitive to how the different newspapers treated it, and it varied, especially by between those newspapers that saw themselves as tribunes of public virtue and as sources of information. That is, they were mainly existed to inform the public, like the New York Times or the New York Tribune. And then those other newspapers, like the New York World or the Journal, that had been upstarts and were much, much larger in circulation than the Times or the Tribune. But they saw themselves as what we would call infotainment in a way, not just to tell stories or to inform, but to inform in in an entertaining way. To play to the reader as opposed to asking the reader to play to them. And so looking at how the informative versus the entertaining or sensational newspapers told the same stories, but in slightly different ways, that became part of what fascinated me about this story as well.
And we'll mention you cite or bring in at least 12 papers. And this, again, like you're saying, this is an age pre-radio, pre-television, obviously. And these were papers that were printed in the morning. They were evening papers. So conceivably, someone could be running to see how did the Brooklyn Daily Eagle cover this, or they were getting the World in the morning and the Telegram at night. It is hard to overestimate the influence and reach of these papers back then.
Yeah, they were absolutely a part of people's lives. The reading of them, the selling of them, the delivery of them. This was a huge element of urban culture and society at the time, not just New York, but especially in New York, which really set the tone, set the models for competing forms of American journalism at the time. So, yeah, I read a lot of newspapers. And again, I know this is, I don't know, you either like this about historians or you don't, the way we disappear into these worlds and read tens and tens of thousands of words about this one very minor incident in 1914. I think one of the...
I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to interject that you mentioned this in the piece, but it's the start of World War I in Europe, the sinking of the Lusitania. So there's a lot of other competing world information and news coming out at the same time as this.
Yeah, maybe it was relief from everything else that was going on in the world at the time. But it really knocked the Great War off the front page in some respects. And not just in New York City. Accounts of the Freeport murder mystery were in newspapers all over the United States. I think I said from Miami to Anchorage. In Australia, you can find coverage of the Carman murder trial, and it appeals to people in a lot of respects. I think there's a lot of the attention is generated by fascinating with the new woman, or especially just with womanhood in modern urban culture. are these women who seem to, to act on their own and to be causing trouble. I mean, spying on your husband, that's at least some kind of deviation from the model of maternal happiness that we would expect at the time.
So what would you find are some of the maybe the big picture takeaways of the language the papers were using, or the way, or did you notice individual differences between the reporters, or was it pretty much a race to get the most sensational? So what did you learn about the state of, if we call it journalism, for this story?
Yeah, well, at the time, I think it required some contortionist skills, I think, for newspapers that are sober and serious, like the New York Times or the Tribune or the Evening Post, to figure out how to cover this story, which was on its face not important. It's just one murder in a time when there were times were not as deadly then as they are now, but there was no shortage of violence in American life at the time. But people wanted to read about this. So to see the New York Times or the Evening Post twist and stretch to present a story with sufficient details without tipping over into the world of yellow journalism, like for the Hearst and the Pulitzer papers, was itself amusing, because they couldn't resist the story. They couldn't ignore it. And they couldn't ignore what was tantalizing about it. This peering inside a scandalized marriage, and eventually even the whole question of why Mrs. Bailey was there and the doctor's its practice of providing illegal operations.
Which I don't have your exact language, but at the time it was illegal and openly practiced in a way, right? So it was, except people would know what they were talking about, a common practice at the time, even though it was literally illegal.
Yeah, it was illegal in state law. Abortions were illegal, but people follow several kinds of law. There are the laws in the books, and then there's the there are the laws that we operate by in our everyday lives outside the courts or outside the purview of state authorities. And in this case, and at this time, this particular story, I think, revealed the disjunction between the law in the books and the laws that people live by. That is, that New Yorkers, at least, and so far as I can tell, this was no less true in every other place where the story was carried. People tolerated abortion. They accepted that abortion was a kind of accepted. They accepted that abortion was a necessary part of life. It was something that women, especially, talked about with each other and conveyed information to other women. It circulated among friends. It circulated among family members. But it was not talked about in public. It was kind of a taboo public subject. But Dr. Carman, who it became obvious later, 10 or so years after his wife's acquittal, was well known, understood broadly in that area of Long Island and maybe even into New York City, that you could visit him and have a problem solved. And even after all the attention that went to the trial and all the information that came out, and especially from the autopsy, there was, to my knowledge, no effort to prosecute him or investigate him or harass him. There were no state or local medical authorities that peered into his practice, to stop him from doing what he was doing, to take away his license, or to turn him over to authorities. So everything indicates that he continued his life much as it had been before after the acquittal. And in truth, we will never know why Mrs. Bailey was murdered, if she was the intended victim. But I think we're much more confident in saying that we know why she was in the wrong place at the wrong time that afternoon.
Right, and just like you alluded to, flash forward, I think 10 years later, Dr. Carman loses a patient. A woman dies after visiting him, and the husband sues, or it comes out. He loses his license. He walks away from practicing because a woman died as a result of what he was doing. I just wanted to quickly go back to a few of the media frenzy. And it's interesting, during the trial, a silent movie came out based on the case. They must have filmed very quickly, but apparently the suspicious wife was drawn from the headlines, and did they actually have to suppress the release of it for the trial, I think?
Yeah, this was a time when you could produce these these short silents overnight, and they were very responsive to market conditions, and incidents were routinely ripped from the headlines and immediately turned into silent films, and then universally distributed into Nickelodeons at the time. And so, of course, the Carmen's murder mystery was begging to be put into film, and the district attorney in Nassau County had to intervene to keep it from being distributed out of fear that it would taint the potential jury pool. And I'm not sure why they would have been any more tainted by seeing a film version of it than they would have by reading all of the newspaper accounts at the time. But for some reason, they thought that was important, and that is what happened. It's worth mentioning, though, that Mrs. Carman then ends up on the vaudeville stage, Mrs. Florence Carman, after her acquittal. And she has a very brief, but no doubt somewhat lucrative theatrical career, monetizing her very short-lived fame. So the more things change, I guess.
Right. She became a reality star, right, cashing in. And the other thing I made note of, so one of the reporters, Gertrude Atherton, who covered I don't know what paper she was writing for, but, attended the trial, obviously, and then wrote a fictionalized account of it, loosely based on the case. Did you look at Mrs. Balfame, I think? Did you actually dip into that novel, or?
Oh, I've read it, front to back, cover to cover. Excuse me. Gertrude Atherton, well, was a very popular novelist at the time and wrote a lot of books. But she was also regarded as an authority on the domestic situation. That her novels explored marital life and modern American life. And so the newspaper, of course, hired her to sit in and provide word sketches of the people involved, not really blow by blow account of the trial, but character analysis and a kind of psychological insight. And Atherton saw an opportunity for a book here in which she put her own spin on the issues at stake here, changing some important details. But for me, at least, speaking more truthfully about what was really at the center of this whole terrible incident. And I do want to say that it was terrible. This murder of Louise Bailey was nothing to laugh at, and I don't want to make it. I don't want it to seem that I am making light of it at all. She was in a desperate situation, pregnant, and probably in a situation where she felt that having another child was not good for her, and in maybe an uncertain marital situation there. It may not have even have been her husband's child. We don't know. But she went there to seek help in solving this problem.
And any last, I know we talked about a lot, but anything you want to get across maybe that we didn't say, or just a point you want to add to it, or?
Well, I should say that I am convinced or persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt that Mrs. Carman shot Louise Bailey, and that she didn't mean to shoot Mrs. Bailey. She meant to shoot her husband. And I think the most likely reason is that the motivation had to do with his secret practice, or his openly secret practice as a provider of abortion services. That's the most persuasive, to me, explanation of what happened that unfortunate early evening after dinner, and in the small town of Freeport. This case, this investigation, the trials, everything else put Freeport very briefly on the map of countless people in the early 20th century. And then Freeport went back to being what it had always been, a small and eventually suburban town on Long Island. But I was glad to spend a little newspaper time, at least, in the town of Freeport.
And thank you once again to Dr. Woody Register. We recorded on Libsyn Connect, and you can find links in our show notes to related resources. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. As I mentioned, I kind of stumbled into a Freeport trilogy, so we've got one more episode coming up soon that will round it out. We'll be flash forwarding a bit in time, taking a different subject matter, but we're going to bring it home in style. If you'd like to get in touch with us, if you want to drop us a note or share your own research into Long Island history or suggest a topic or just say hello, you can reach us at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know you're out there. Let us know what you're liking about this podcast and any suggestions you have. That does it for another episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.